Welcome to Interviews from Quito. Today we have with us Atilio Boron, an Argentine political sociologist and the author of over a dozen books. He's also the winner of the Liberator Prize in Critical Thinking for Latin America and the Geopolitics of Imperialism. First of all, thank you very much for agreeing to come to Telesur English and to our series of interviews from Quito.
Mm-hmm.
It's a privilege to have you here. I've been following your work for a long time now, and it's great to finally meet.
Thank you for the invitation.
My pleasure. And so I want to start, first of all, maybe I think one of the best places to start is perhaps with the book for which you recently received a prize. Well, actually it's now 2 years ago, the 2012 Liberator Prize for Critical Thinking, and the book that you did on Latin America and the politics of, or the geopolitics of imperialism. And I was wondering if you could maybe just briefly summarize to us what the kind of the main themes or main issues are in that book, and what exactly is the place of Latin America in today's world politics?
Well, basically the idea of the book was to show that Latin America is by far the most important region for the U.S., especially for the U.S. government, which runs against the current opinion, which says that Latin America is in the 4th or 5th degree of priority of the U.S. This is something that repeatedly is said by high-ranking officials of the State Department or even the White House. No, in occasion of the failed coup d'état here in Ecuador in 2010. The Undersecretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, Arturo Valenzuela, said that President Obama was too busy watching other situations in the world, and he said something like this, that for us the first priority is the Middle East, because the problem of Iraq, Palestine, Israel, Iran, etc. Second place is the situation in Europe, especially relationship between Europe and Russia. Third place is the Far East because of China, South Korea, North Korea, and Japan. In fourth place, Central Asia because of the fundamentalists, mujahidims, and jihadism, etc. And only in the fifth place comes Latin America, which is so you just relax, don't press too hard. We don't have time for ask our president to pay attention to what is going on in Latin America. Latin America comes really in the fifth place, and this is a fantastic mistake, or I would say misinformation, which is given to the general public, because for many reasons Latin America, the book proves that, has been at the top of the priorities of the White House since the times of President John Adams. So we are talking the end of the 18th century, right? Yeah, and this is why the first foreign policy doctrine elaborated by the State Department was the Monroe Doctrine. So it's quite paradoxical that a region which is irrelevant was the first to receive the prize of having the first foreign policy doctrine of the U.S., which is the Monroe Doctrine, dated in 1823. Even before our country became independent from Spain, already the U.S. government knows what to do regarding Latin America. The second,
well, I mean, it has always been called America's backyard. As a matter of fact,
yes, exactly.
Secretary of State John Kerry recently even called it,
yes,
literally,
yes,
America's backyard.
In the meeting with the Organization of American States.
So
this is
but at the same time, Republicans have criticized both Obama and also even George Bush for having neglected Latin America. So what evidence do you see that it continues to have this importance?
Well, Latin America has today the country with the major proved oil reserves in the world, which is Venezuela. It's no longer Saudi Arabia. And knowing the need that the U.S. has for foreign oil, because all the plans to self-sufficiency in oil so far have failed, it is, of course, only a matter of sensible thought that a country like Venezuela, which is just 4 days of navigation within the Caribbean Sea, can provide enormous amount of oil to a oil-thirsty country like the U.S. And you have oil not only in Venezuela. Brazil has a huge reservoir of oil offshore, and of course there is oil in Colombia, or in Peru, in Ecuador. So oil is one. But more important than oil is water. Latin America, especially South America, has, according to several estimates which coincide in the number, between 40 and 43% of all the safe water of the world. Okay, so on water, if you look at the strategies of the Pentagon, all of them said that the 21st century wars will be water wars, wars for access to water, and we have enough water. More than, we have only 7% of the world population and between 40 and 43% of the total water reserves. So that's, in addition, according to reports from the Pentagon, 7 of the 10 more important strategic minerals needed for the defense industry of the US are found in Latin American countries. Add to that, in the rainforest of the Amazonian basin, which is enormous, Amazonian and sub-Amazonian basin, reaching until Paraguay and the northeast of Argentina, you have 50% of the world biodiversity. So, in addition, possibilities of providing food for more than 1 billion people in addition to our own. So this is why the US, which is not ignorant of all these facts, has also devoted special attention, very special attention to Latin America. But of course, they are very good negotiators, and they would never say to us that we are very important. On the contrary, what they say, you are not important, you are irrelevant, so accept what we are ready to give you, and do not try to bargain with us because you are irrelevant. And this mentality, this what President Correa called this neocolonial mentality, has penetrated very, very profoundly in the dominant circles in Latin America and the Caribbean. So they repeat this story or this analysis made by the policymakers in the US for their own advantage and for our own disadvantage.
Would it be possible to say, in a sense, that the United States is playing a long game, in the sense that it's giving the impression that it doesn't pay that much attention to Latin America? As a matter of fact, many of the countries of Latin America have become very leftist in the last 10 to 15 years. And so it would look like, it certainly would reinforce the notion that the United States has in some ways lost, quote unquote, Latin America. But if there's a longer strategic vision behind that, what kind of evidence do you see for that?
Well, let me say to begin that, for instance, the US government has accepted in countries elsewhere, Latin America, things that are completely unacceptable here. I have a favorite comparison, which is the situation, for instance, in Zimbabwe, in which you have the government which is not of the like of the US in Africa, okay, which in a moment has also very socialistic rhetoric and so on, and the US never tried to intervene militarily in Zimbabwe. And they were putting some pressure in the government, but not too much. Compare that with a very small island in the Caribbean, the island of Grenada, 1983, in the Reagan years, okay? And a small population, 60,000 people was the population of Grenada. Main export product was
nutmeg.
Nutmeg, exactly. Was the basic product was nutmeg, okay? But they have a radical government led by Maurice Bishop, okay? And Bishop had the very bad idea for him to extend the airfield to make possibly the reception of wide fuselage planes to promote tourism in the island, because they have nothing more than nutshell. Okay, what was the response of the Reagan administration? Invasion, accusing Bishop to be preparing the field for Russian or Soviet airplanes to attack America. And so he sent an expedition of 6,000 Marines, 6,000 Marines, 10% of the population. Of course, they destroy everything. They 2 or 3 days after Bishop, his wife, and several members of the cabinet were shot to death, disappeared, and that was the reaction. Why? Because Grenada is in Latin America, and Zimbabwe is far away. They don't give a damn for Zimbabwe. But they are extremely concerned of anything happening in Latin America. And also, if you look at the history of foreign interventions of the US troops in all the continent, there is no possible comparison between Latin America and the Caribbean and Africa or Asia or Oceania. Because why? Well, because we are absolutely essential for the US. And this is basically what I want to mention in the book. And this is why they have a long-run strategy for us. What has been? Well, if you have governments leaning to the left, try to dislodge them, if possible, within electoral framework. If not, then organize a coup d'etat. So this is one strategy. Now, in the current times, they are using something much more complicated, using the press, okay, systematic attacks on the press, creating political parties of the right, but with a new face, a sort of maquillage, trying to present them not as the ugly characters of the past time in which conservatives in Latin America were quite ugly, not palatable for the general public, very staunch conservatives, authoritarian, patriarchal, everything you can imagine. And now they are creating something in which the typical case is Capriles, Enrique Capriles in Venezuela. Now the US embassies are quite busy trying to invent other Capriles in Ecuador, in Bolivia, in Argentina, in Brazil, in Uruguay. That's one strategy. But when that fails, then sedition is the other alternative, what we have seen in Venezuela since February this year, in which they passed to open insurrection with the support of the US government, which supports the activities of people committing crimes that if they were made in the US, those guys would be in jail for 20, 25, or even life sentence, like the case of Leopoldo Lopez in Venezuela. If Lopez would have done what he did in Venezuela in the US, he would have to face a life sentence or at least 25 years. Okay, but the U.S. says that he is a political dissident and he's a political prisoner. It's not. He's someone who committed crimes that in the American law are extremely severely penalized. And, well, they are trying then to combine all these things, no? The mediatic attack, recreation of the right, modernization of the Latin American right, and if all this fails, well, conspiracy, sedition, subversion, and whatever. What is the basic goal is to produce a retrogression of the situation of Latin America to the point we were the night of December 31st, 1958. So on the whispers of the Cuban Revolution, in which all the continent was completely dependent on what the US said. Everybody will follow. And of course, this is an impossible task, but they are working very, very hard in all the continent trying to reach that goal.
Well, certainly many of the left governments in Latin America, particularly the more leftist ones, such as Ecuador, Bolivia, Venezuela, Cuba, are very aware of these efforts of destabilizing, of trying to overthrow them. I'm wondering, what do you think of their kind of strategy of trying to counter those destabilization efforts? And, you know, they're also thinking geostrategically in terms of, you know, with ALBA and other regional integration efforts. What do you think of these kinds of strategies?
Well, I think that so far, unfortunately, we don't have a general continental strategy to repel a continental offensive. So there is a continental offensive against all this government, and the center of the offensive is the US. There is no question on that. There is a lot of hundreds of millions of dollars which are invested in this adventure. But so far, the countries in the South, in Latin America, did not develop a common strategy. They have to do that. They must do that if they want to counter this offensive. And I think that in that sense, we are still behind the schedule. This is something which we have to be done soon, because time is running very, very fast. And the integration is a necessary step in order to prevent the success of this strategy. The problem is that integration is facing difficulties in this time in Latin America. To begin with, because we have that the general economic crisis, which is affecting very badly Europeans, is affecting the US, is affecting Japan, okay, and has started to make an impact on the countries in Latin America, and in that sense, this created more difficulties to advance, to progress in the direction of closer economic ties, because the countries are, all of our countries are weakened, as Europe is weakened, as the US is weakened in economic terms because of the crisis. And when you have such a weakness, then it's very difficult to advance in process of integration. For instance, every country will have the temptation to, well, save itself, okay, act in terms of egoistic national interest and putting aside the necessity for a common strategy, which common strategy in many cases implies to make some renunciations in favor of a collective strategy. So in that sense, we are facing difficulties in that point. Secondly, because the US has very powerful allies within Latin America, in which there are countries which are more ready to follow the directions given by the White House than the directions given by their own people, which are asking for growing integration. I mean, for instance, you have countries like Peru and Colombia or Mexico, which are very, very compliant with anything the US government is asking to them. And they are working as Trojan horses within the process on the schemes of integration like the CELAC, the Latin American and Caribbean community, recently created, or within UNASUR. You have to consider, for instance, within UNASUR, countries like Colombia and Peru have several US military bases in their territory, and the bases were agreed upon between the governments of Lima and Bogota with Washington. So integration is very difficult because within UNASUR you have governments which are saying, please send troops and American bases in our territory, they will be welcome. Cases of Peru, cases of Colombia. Colombia is very proud. President Uribe, former President Uribe, said that we are proud to have become the South America Israel. Okay, and then it is very difficult to progress in the process of integration with
There's another factor also, which is more the economic factor of the free trade agreements that are being negotiated with Colombia and with Central America, with Mexico. Yeah. Well, that has already existed with through the FTA, I mean the Free Trade Area of the Americas, and sorry, the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And now Ecuador is being forced to sign essentially a free trade agreement with Europe.
Yes.
And then there's a Trans-Pacific Partnership and all these things.
Yeah.
Surely those undermine the efforts of regional integration
they are stumbling rocks in the process of integration. And add to all these factors, okay, the death of President Hugo Chavez, because President Hugo Chavez was the main force in the process of growing integration within Latin America since the early 21st century. And the passing away of Hugo Chavez left a void which so far has not been filled. There is nobody who can replace Chavez in that. Of course, Presidents Correa or Evo Morales are very important in this, but they don't have the pull that Chavez had, which is something absolutely exceptional. No, was a man of determination, a courage, and especially a strategic vision. We owe a lot to Chavez because he taught to many of us to think in terms of long-run geopolitical and geostrategic considerations, something which the left in Latin America usually did not take into account, among other things because there was this erroneous idea that the geopolitical thinking was inherently conservative, and that was a major mistake. Even something showing some kind of ignorance, because if they have read the classic of Marxism, like Marx, but especially Engels and especially Lenin and Trotsky, they were very, very well attuned to this kind of geopolitical thinking. But then Latin American left was more concerned with only economic issues of exploitation and all that, okay, and not this kind of other considerations. So Chavez is no longer here, and this is a weakening factor in the process of integration.
Do you think that perhaps the left movements in Latin America have acquired or adopted or somehow incorporated geopolitical thinking so that perhaps from the bottom there could be a greater push towards this kind of what you're talking about, geostrategic thinking, towards a push towards greater integration? I mean, we see some evidence for that, I would say, perhaps with the World Social Forums and then the regional social forums. That might be some kind of concept for trying to tie these movements together on a more strategic, more global level, perhaps, to push social movements, that is, as a counterforce, so it doesn't have to rely on a particular leader so much.
Yeah, well, yes, there is a growing awareness of the importance of the strategic geopolitical thinking. There is no question on that in the last years, okay, because, well, there was a growing attention paid to this very, very changing international chessboard, to use this metaphor by Zbigniew Brzezinski, and people started to realize that all these major changes we are shaking the international structure have a very strong impact on us. An impact which can be positive or can be very, very negative. And so I think that social movements and grassroots organizations are starting to realize that this is very important. I can give you my own experience. When I published the book, okay, I would say that almost nobody paid attention. And then, especially after the prize, which really I was honored by the prize given by the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, which helped me to improve the dissemination of the book. The response of popular organizations was fantastic within Argentina, but in other countries, in Brazil, in Chile, in Colombia, in Peru, in Mexico, okay, of course in Cuba, in Venezuela itself, in which I have not the response of the intellectuals or the scholars, but essentially the grassroots organization, people, you see, with very low level of education, but which were strongly concerned with the implication. What does it mean that China is becoming the major economic power in the coming, I don't know, 5 to 10 years? What means for us in Latin America, okay? What means for us the return of Russia to the major leagues in international politics? And they are starting to connect all these major changes which are taking place with the prospects of their own life in our own country, because this means that the international scenario now is very different. We used to think that the only important actor in the international field was the US, and now they are realizing that there are other actors which are coming, and also you have things like BRICS, which is very important because Brazil is involved in BRICS, and so the impact is very strong. And even this meeting we have in Ecuador these days, it was really quite impressive, the relevance which was given to this kind of geopolitical considerations. I was really surprised because this was not common. In the past you have a gathering of the left-wing parties in Latin America, and what you would hear was only an economic analysis, very narrow-minded economic analysis, in which eventually they would talk about imperialism, but essentially it was quite domestic, the approach. And now in almost every one of the papers or lectures given by the people, there was always a consideration of this geopolitical factor. How will Latin America react to these new challenges coming from the changing international scenario?
Well, another factor perhaps, not only the recognition of the role of the United States, but of course there's a more global consciousness perhaps developing as a result of crises such as the global climate change that's taking place, which requires much larger solutions and requires people to think on a more global and geostrategic level.
Yes, and also international migration, the impact of all this question of international migration, and also another factor, Greg, which is very important, is the revelation of the WikiLeaks. And the contribution, exceptional contribution, which was so recognized by Noam Chomsky, of Edward Snowden and Julian Assange to this kind of political awakening of the of the world population, of large sections, especially in the youth. And this is something which a very clever thinker of the empire, which is Brzezinski, underlines very well in his most recent book. He talks about the political awakening of the youth in the third world countries. And he's right, pointing that situation, because that political awakening has to do with the fact that we know now, thanks to WikiLeaks, thanks to Assange, thanks to Snowden, that some dirty things which were made in the international scenario, which were denounced by us from the left, were not regarded as true, because they say, well, what these critics say is because they are extremely anti-imperialist, they don't look at the facts. And now the facts are there. And this has produced a shocking impact and in many people who say, well, really, we know that the US is doing these very bad things here and there, and so this has created the necessity to have a geostrategic thinking to save our own sovereignty, our democracy, our independence. The fact that, for instance, in one old book by Brzezinski, which I am studying very, very closely, like I am studying not only myself, many people have, thank God we are starting to read the major strategies of the empire, like Henry Kissinger, for instance. In the book of 1997, by Brzezinski, called The Great World Chessboard, right? He said that the American supremacy was out of question, because the Soviet Union was gone, has disappeared, no longer there. And he said there are three complicated scenarios which may appear during the next decades or so. One is an agreement between China and Japan. But he said the chances are very, very small because of rivalries, etc., etc. Second complicated scenario is an agreement between Moscow, Berlin, and Paris. But he said it's very difficult also to implement. Germany is a major ally of the US. This has very, very little chance. And he said there is a third possibility, which is remote as a possibility, much less than the other two. It's an agreement between Russia, China, and Iran. And this is exactly what happened. This is exactly what happened. So the worst case scenario that Brzezinski depicted in the book of 1997 appear now as what has been consolidating in the last, I would say, 12 months, with an aggravation, which is the following. India was not in the picture, but very recently, when the premier of India was in the US, he made stunning declarations, statements to the CNN, saying that Russia is acting rationally and rightfully in the case of Ukraine. He said nothing about the annexation of Crimea to Russia. And even more important, he said that China is acting with responsibility in the conflict in the South China Sea. Can you imagine now, not only you have Russia, China, and Iran, but now you have India having struck a deal, a very important deal with China. So this is, and this situation, which is really a dramatic move in the tectonic plaques of the international system, is impinging directly on us, because in that very unfavorable international scenario, it is just a matter of course that the US will try to reassure his standing in this continent, which is their patio trasero, their backyard, as they used to say.
But that's surely getting more and more difficult now.
Yes, it will be very, very difficult because, you know, they have tried to oust Evo Morales in 2008 and failed. They tried here in Ecuador against Correa and failed, but they won in two battles, important, in Honduras and in 2009 and in Paraguay in 2012. And they are trying to see if they can maneuver to produce a regression in countries like Argentina and Brazil, but will be very, very difficult, especially because the US is also embarked in military adventures still in Afghanistan. The situation in Iraq has been out of control recently, and they have created monsters. My opinion is that Washington is specializing in creating monsters that they came back to fight against the Americans. They created Saddam Hussein. We don't forget, we should not forget that, just to fight against the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And then Saddam Hussein became the major public enemy of the US. They created Al-Qaeda. They created Al-Qaeda, tried to fight the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan. And then there was a statement by Snowden and also by a high-ranking officer of the US Navy saying that we created, so we Americans, we created now the ISIS or the Estado Islámico, Islamic State. We recruited them, we armed them, we financed them with the help of our allies, the Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the Emirates. And now they are against us. So I think that the US will have little chances to stop the process of change here in Latin America. Of course, they will try. They have an enormous amount of money invested in this, but in this moment they are, I would say, trapped in the crisis in the Middle East, in which, to make things worse, Israel is not longer an obedient pawn of Washington. It's developing a policy which is not what Washington prefers. I don't think that Washington is happy having a genocide against the Palestinians every year and or every 2 years, because it creates more problems for the US foreign policy. But they cannot control any longer the neo-fascist government in Israel. So it's a situation in which I think Latin America could take advantage of this, because they are too busy trying to solve the problem that they have created. When I am of course not talking about the American people, but the American leading classes or the dominant classes in the rest of the world.
Okay. Well, on that note, on that positive note, perhaps, although very worrying and concerning note as well, thank you very much for being here. It was a pleasure and very interesting, and we will have this on our website, Telusui English, for broadcast.
Thank you, Greg. It was a very interesting interview, and I'm more than grateful for this possibility to talk to the English-speaking people.
Thank you.